So I was going to talk a little bit more about Aristotle today, but I did that yesterday, so I'll switch over to one of my favorite philosophers, Søren Kierkegaard. So this book that I'm going to read out of is The Present Age, and he wrote this in the mid-19th century, so really, really long time ago. But the problems he's writing about back then, a lot of them we face today, and this is one of the most important ones, I think. This is about the press, because at this point, you know, when he's writing this, the Napoleonic era is just coming to an end, and newspapers are starting to become really, really popular. Like, people really genuinely care what's in the newspapers, and even generals like Admiral Horatio Nelson and the British fleet, they talk about how he was cognizant of, like, well, what do I do on the battlefield? And then he would think, oh, well, what are the papers going to say that I did back home? Like, you know, like, this might be the best decision, but is it the best political decision? So you start to see the formation of the press as a political entity. It's not just a tool of information. Right from the very beginning, it's being used to sort of influence actions. So Kierkegaard talks about the role of the press here. So the press is an abstraction, since a paper is not a concrete part of a nation, and only in an abstract sense an individual, which, in conjugation with the passionless and reflective character of the age, produces that abstract phantom, a public, which is, in its turn, is really the leveling power. Consequently, it has an important aspect, apart from its negative religious importance. The fewer ideas there are at any time, the more indolent and exhausted by bursts of enthusiasm will it be. Nevertheless, if we imagine the press growing weaker and weaker because no events or ideas catch hold of the age, the more easily will the process of leveling become a harmful pleasure, a form of sensual intoxication which flames up for a moment, simply making the evil worse and the conditions of salvation more difficult, and the probability of decline more certain. Although the demoralization brought about by autocracy and the decay of revolutionary periods have often been described, the decay of an age without passion is something just as harmful, though, on account of its ambiguity, it's less obvious. So what Kierkegaard is talking about here is this sort of rough interplay that the press has to negotiate, where it can latch onto something that's extreme, like it's a really passionate idea. And keep in mind, this is rhetoric that's coming very shortly out of the French Revolution. So there's been a huge amount of war and death and blood that just came from this sort of half-successful revolution. I mean, France did become a republic, sort of. It did eventually succeed, but Kierkegaard wasn't writing this at a time when, you know, France was a republic again. They went back into a monarchy, everything collapsed, it kind of turned into a disaster. And the papers had a huge influence in the French Revolution. Like, the papers were completely on their side. There was one written by a really famous guy with a skin condition that kept him in a bath, named, I can't remember, Jean-Paul Marat. And Marat wrote a paper called The Friend of the People. And in The Friend of the People, he would write down lists of people that they needed to kill because they were enemies of the revolution. They didn't have the interests of La France at heart, so they needed to die. So keep in mind, okay, before we get too negative about the press, that's Kierkegaard's perspective here. He also talks about, so obviously the press can do some terrible, terrible things where if the press is irresponsible, that can be a huge problem because they will lead people. They'll lead the public into doing something that's really, really dangerous. And Kierkegaard, it's one of the things I have to wrestle with him. He talks about this esoteric public. I don't really think that the public, as we conceive of it, is really a thing. Like, to think of who's an average everyday person that you know. I find when most people say the word the public, they don't actually mean like there's some secret sort of person out there that nobody knows that is just the average Joe. The average Joe doesn't really exist, right? The word "the public" just means not me and not anyone that I know. It's just sort of a way to have a derogatory term for the everybody else. I don't like it, but I mean, he is writing in a time of aristocracy, so it's fine. And it is key to understanding his ideas. He really does think that there are certain people who are leaders and certain people who are followers. So for the sake of discussing his ideas, we'll accept this notion of the public, the everyone. So he says the media, of course, like the media, back then it was just the newspapers, but I guess for us, in our present age, we'd just be talking about, social media, news sites. There's a responsibility there to recognize that you are the source of information for a lot of people, and that they'll act on what you tell them. So of course you have to be very, very cognizant of what it is you're telling people. There's a danger there too, because when we create an authority out of print or news, then that authority needs to be held to account. And people, and Soren takes note of this too, and again, this is coming right on the heels of a revolution in France. He notes that there's nothing that people love more than to take some authority and just tear it to shreds when they find that it's not legitimate. Thinking in modern terms, like when we find out, like just we people on the internet, when we find out that a news outlet has lied or that they've deceptively edited footage, it'll be on the internet in like 2 minutes, and then everyone will go crazy. Like there'll be just so much shame and constantly bashing the news because you lied. And so, I mean, I don't particularly like the way that he thinks of like the proles are some lesser group in society, but in terms of his prediction of, look, if the authority messes up or if the authority lies, then the public will just rip them to shreds. And where's the lie? There's another side to it though, where if you allow it to get to the point where the people just don't trust the media anymore, and I think in a lot of places in the West, it's reaching that point where we don't really listen to news anymore. We don't read the newspapers. We just use alternative news sources. When that authority is gone, that's really bad too, because then that fire of information and unity that brought people together and could actually affect useful social change, that will disappear. And that's not a good thing to have happen, because then you get apathy, and apathy is awful. I can't remember who coined the phrase, but the only thing necessary for evil to gain power is for good men to do nothing. And action has to be informed. You can't get a large group of people to do something unless you've got that collective education that comes from having an authoritative news source. If that goes away, Kierkegaard is warning in that passage that, well, expect people to become apathetic, expect people to stop voting, expect people to just not care anymore. In a slightly more grim way later in the book, he's like, well, I mean, suicide rates are going to go up, and unemployment will go up, and people will just have less satisfaction with life because they're not really living for each other. They've just created little archipelagos for themselves. So that's a warning from, like easily, when you write this, maybe 180 years ago, 170 years ago, somewhere around there. It's pretty prescient though. Like when people don't trust news sources, they'll just go and hide into their own spots. And yes, some people will, I have to take responsibility and go search for the truth elsewhere. But that's not really what we're for. That's what we built the news to do. And if it doesn't do that, if it's an authority that doesn't deserve its authority, we'll get rid of it. And that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for us to get rid of it, even if it's not doing what it should be doing. Because if we don't have that unification, then you get what's called balkanization, where everyone just forms smaller and smaller groups, and then those groups fight, and then inside of one of those groups it'll split again. It won't be good. And I think we might be starting to see that. I hope it doesn't continue, but in order for that to stop, that trust that he talks about needs to be reaffirmed. And if I'm being honest, I don't really see any moves to make that happen. Yeah, I think that just about covers it for today. So that's Kierkegaard on the role of the press and what happens when it doesn't do its job.